Hello there. In this video, we'll take a closer look at the concept of heaven and the intermediate state in the New Testament. But first, what and where is heaven? In both the Old and New Testaments, the word for heaven is the same as the term used for sky. In the New Testament Greek, uranos is translated heaven over 90% of the time, and sky just under 10%. Typically, when translators use the word heaven, they're referring to the abode of God and or his angels. But because the sky is the realm of the gods, determining whether uranos should be translated as heaven or sky in any given instance is tricky. While we as modern readers might feel frustrated by such ambiguity, original readers likely felt no need to distinguish between the two concepts. The sky was the dwelling place of the gods, a place where physical and spiritual realities overlapped. So attempting to determine whether a particular usage of heaven refers to the realm of God or to the sky is to make an artificial distinction not typically found in the text itself. Along such lines, the usage of words like above and below don't necessarily denote spatial directions. Ancient peoples of the Near East believed that the universe was comprised of three tiers: the upper realm of the gods, the middle realm of the earth, and the lower realm of the underworld. Although such conceptions faded somewhat over time, the authors of the New Testament were influenced by such cosmic geography as we are still today. Scriptural authors use the language, philosophy, and theology available to them to describe cosmic realities beyond the scope of comprehension. The exact relationship between the realm of God and the realm of humanity simply is not defined by the biblical text. In fact, heaven is more a person than a place, since the defining trait of heaven is God himself. So heaven, the locus of God's presence, might be more accurately described as an alternate reality. Wright explains that Jesus will not return, quote, like a spaceman from the sky, end quote, nor will he simply reappear. When heaven and earth are joined in the eschaton, Jesus will appear to his people, and we will appear to him in the new creation. In fact, Jesus, the first fruits of our redemption, already resides in heaven and earth. Even when he's on earth, he's in heaven because he's the embodiment of God's presence. What Scripture asks you and I to grasp in the light of Christ's work is that God's space is no longer separated from ours. The veil that separated God from his people was ripped away. Beale explains that through Christ, quote, the coming new creation penetrated back into this world through the resurrected new creational body of Jesus, end quote. And although God's space for the moment remains distinct from the physical dwelling of his people, the future return of Christ will fuse the two domains fully. Now, in any discussion of resurrection or heaven, the intermediate state is always a topic of interest. If we don't, quote, go to heaven right when we die, what happens while we're waiting on the resurrection? Well, authors of Scripture just aren't as interested in this question as we are, and they don't have much to say about it, unfortunately. But from the little information we have, we can discern two possible options. First, passages from both Paul and the Gospels seem to indicate that those who have died are in a state of sleep. This idea that the dead await the resurrection in a state of unconsciousness, sometimes called soul sleep, is also in line with Old Testament expectations in which death was equated to sleeping. Numerous other passages, however, seem to indicate that saints will be consciously in the presence of God immediately upon death. The first verse that comes to mind for most people is 2 Corinthians 5:8, Paul's statement that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And perhaps the clearest statement about the intermediate state comes from Jesus himself. In Luke 23:43, Christ says to the criminal on the cross beside him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." So paradise, at least in this passage, appears to be a resting place where the dead await resurrection in the presence of God. The Greek term paradise, paradisos, is used only 3 times in the New Testament, the first of which is in the aforementioned passage. The second usage is in 2 Corinthians 12:4. In this puzzling passage, Paul seems to describe his own temporary journey into God's presence in heaven/paradise. In the final passage, Revelation 2:7, we learn that righteous saints are granted the right to eat from the tree of life in paradise. Clearly, this eventuality takes place after death, but whether in the intermediate state or the new creation is unclear. If such an intermediate paradise exists, therefore, we should clarify that it is a temporary dwelling, not the final destiny of God's people. In summary, we must conclude with less specificity than we desire. There's simply no uniform New Testament statement on the status of the believer between the time of death and resurrection. Wright, however, does bring a measure of accord between the two seemingly contrasting options of waiting in paradise or sleeping until the resurrection. He proposes that the New Testament language of sleeping may simply be a useful way of describing a stage of temporary inactivity or tranquil rest as opposed to complete unconsciousness. So that's all Scripture gives us about the intermediate state, but there is more to say about heaven. Hop on to the next video where we'll go more in depth on heaven in the writings of Paul and the Synoptic Gospels.